Good morning, boys and girls. My name is Miss Katie, and I'm your host. This is your teacher, Mr. Zach.
Hello, everyone.
Today, we will be learning more about the earth inside out.
All right, thanks, Miss Katie.
You're welcome.
So, if you remember last time, we started our unit on the history of the earth, and we're going to learn all about the earth. So, before we start our new lesson today, let's do a quick review of some of the things that we learned during our last lesson, okay? I'm going to use this. Now, I'm sure some of you guys out there probably remember what we call this, right? It's called a globe. Awesome. And a globe, like we said in the last lesson, is a special model or a copy of the planet Earth. We can use a globe to learn all about the things that are on the planet Earth. And models like this are useful to scientists because I very regularly couldn't have taken the whole Earth and showed it to you like this on a table. So when we use models like globes, it helps to identify and see things that might be hard to examine because they're too big or too small or too hard to get to. Now, we learned as we look at the globe, the Earth is covered in land, and we know that this land, right, is sometimes on this globe it's green or brown, or depending on where it is, we have all these different beautiful colors. And these big pieces of land on the planet Earth, we call those continents, okay? Now, when we spin and we look at the globe or look at the Earth as a whole, we notice that most of it's not covered in continents or land. Most of it's covered in big blue bodies of water. And we like to call, well, we call those big blue bodies of water Earth's oceans. We also learned that the Earth has a part, the northernmost part of the Earth, where you can see this imaginary stick coming through. That's the North Pole. That's the northernmost point of the planet. And just like on the northernmost part, on the southernmost part of the planet, we also have a point down here, which you can see, called the South Pole. And in the middle, we have this imaginary line that divides the Earth into two equal halves, and we call that line that's right, the equator. Now, while we have the globe like this, something else that we know about the Earth and we can tell on the globe, if you look down here at the South Pole, and you notice the land down here is colored white like snow, and that's because at the poles, at each pole of the Earth, where my fingers are, that's where the Earth's climate is coldest. As we come and we move towards the center of the Earth, where the equator is, we know that's where the warmest temperatures occur on the Earth. We learned that the Earth is mostly made of rock, and we learned about a special scientist. His name is Jerry, who's a geologist who studies rocks. Jerry also taught us about three very important words that we want to remember when we're talking about geology. Do you remember what those three words are? Well, if you said heat, pressure, and time, you're absolutely correct. Remember, the Earth, inside of the Earth, all of the pressure creates tremendous heat. And the pressure of the Earth comes just from it being so big and gravity pushing it down onto itself. And remember, when we're talking about time in geology, we're not talking about minutes, we're not talking about hours or even days. We're talking about years, but a lot of years, like millions of years, or in the case of our planet Earth, billions of years. So before we start our new read aloud today, let's look at a few key vocabulary terms that we need to understand so that we can really learn a lot from our read aloud. Our first word that we're going to learn about today is layer. A layer, when something is a layer, it's just when material is arranged where sections are either on top or below other sections. Now, if we think about something that we all like to eat, which is a sandwich, right? Well, at least I do. It's one of my favorites. You can make anything into a sandwich. But what do you know about a sandwich? A sandwich is made of layers. If I'm going to make a sandwich, what do I have to put on the bottom? I have to put my bread layer. What if I want a piece of cheese? Then I have to put another layer of cheese. Then if I want my special, whatever kind of meat that I like, ham, turkey, or more vegetables, I'm going to put another layer of that. Well, somewhat like a sandwich, the earth is also made of different layers, which we're going to learn about in our next few lessons. So just remember that when something is a layer, that means that it's either above or on top, or it's below something else. Now, the Earth's layers have special names. The top outermost layer of the Earth, we call that the crust. Going back to our sandwich, think about the outside part of a piece of bread, right? Whenever you look at a piece of bread, you notice that the very small outside part, well, that's called the crust too. And just like looking at our picture here, if you see this very thin, it's very thin outside layer of the earth, well, that's the crust too. Okay? The crust of the earth is the outermost part. Everything that we're doing right now happens on or underneath or right above the crust. Now, as we go deeper into the earth, we encounter another layer called the mantle. The mantle is the layer of the earth that comes in between the crust and the core. So if we look back at our picture, we can see the crust is this very thin layer that's right here on the outside. And as we go one layer in, this reddish brown layer, that is Earth's mantle. The Earth's mantle is in between the crust and the core, and the mantle actually takes up most of the Earth. Now, you notice there were a couple more layers that happened in the Earth as well. So underneath the mantle, we have the core. The core of the Earth is the center or the innermost part of the Earth. Now let's go back to our diagram or our picture, and we can see here, if you'll remember, the outermost layer, we called that the crust. Awesome. As we go in here, this reddish brown layer, we just learned that word, that is the mantle. Now, as we look deeper inside the Earth, we see this orange, and then we see this yellow section. Both of these sections are what we call the centermost part of the Earth, or the core. But the core is divided into two separate parts, the outer core, which is in orange, and the inner core, which is in yellow. The core of the Earth is a lot different than the mantle or the crust, because instead of it being hard rock like we're used to, the core of the Earth is actually melted metal. One other word that we want to learn today, one other geological term that's very important to understand when we're talking about geology is the word eroded. Can you say the word eroded? Nice. So when things are worn away because of wind and water, we say that they've been eroded. You may have seen erosion if you've been at the beach. Every time a wave comes up and takes away a little bit more sand out into the ocean, well, that's erosion. That beach is being eroded. So when we think about erosion in geology, and we talk about that word time, over many millions of years, wind and water through erosion can wear away even the biggest rocks. All right, so now that we have a good understanding of those key vocabulary terms, let's move right back in to our unit on the history of the Earth. Lesson 2. Hello, Jerry the geologist here again. I woke up this morning and started digging this hole in the ground. Each time I push my shovel into the earth, I bring up a load of soil. And I've noticed that each load of soil has a few rocks in it. I'm digging this hole today to teach you about the outer layer of the earth. Now, before we move to the next slide, can you remember Jerry is a geologist? Remember, geology is the study of earth. And someone like Jerry, who's a geologist, just means that they study the earth. Beneath your backyard, the sidewalk, the school, actually beneath most every place people live, there is soil, which is sometimes called dirt. Different types of soil can appear in the earth in layers. Each layer of soil is made of different things, which can give it a different color or a different texture. The thickness of the soil varies or is different depending on where you live. In some places on the earth, the soil is several feet thick. In other places on the earth, it's just a few inches. And in some places, there's no soil at all. Here where I live, the soil is rich and dark. However, as I dig deeper into the earth, I can see a definite color change. The color in this soil has changed from dark brown to bright red. That color change means I have reached a layer of reddish clay. It's getting a little harder to dig now, so I'm going to have to use my pickaxe. Clank! My pick just hit something really hard below the red clay. The farther down I go, the harder the clay becomes. Pretty soon, I'm going to hit bedrock, a solid layer of hard rock, and I won't be able to dig through with my shovel. I dug this hole to show you that there are different layers of soil and rock beneath your feet. The farther you go into the earth, the more things change. The dark soil on top is fairly easy to dig into with a shovel. But the deeper layer of clay is harder to dig because it's been compacted or squished by the pressure of everything above it. And just like we learned about why Jerry had to pick his pickaxe, when you go a little bit deeper, more pressure, and then you have a bedrock layer that you can't even dig through with a shovel. This diagram shows you what the inside of Earth would look like if you cut out a big chunk of it. The crust is the outermost layer of the Earth, represented here by a thin brown line. I've been digging into the outermost portion of the crust today. Most of the Earth is rock, and most of that rock is beneath the crust in the other three layers. The mantle, which is red, the outer core, orange, and the inner core, which is yellow. The distance from the surface where you and I live all the way to the middle of the inner core is nearly 4,000 miles. Now that is one thick planet. I will teach you more about the mantle, the outer core, and the inner core next time. For now, let's just focus on the thinnest layer, the crust. The Earth's crust is between 3 and 20 miles, depending on where you are on Earth. Most people, plants, and animals live on the surface or outermost edge of the Earth. Remember, the Earth's surface is covered by oceans and continents. Everything alive on Earth lives in, on, or above these oceans and continents on the crust. For example, you and your family, maybe your dog, y'all all live on the crust. Worms and moles, as you can see in this picture here below the surface, they live underground or in the crust. Birds, well, they fly in the air above the crust. And fish, when they swim underwater, well, that water is actually flowing on the crust as well. The crust is where geologists like me look to learn about the history of the Earth. In the crust, we find different layers of rock, which teach us about different periods of time in the Earth's history. Each layer of rock was formed during a different period of time in the Earth's history, so we can study each layer to learn about each period of time. Geologists search the crust for clues about the history of the Earth. I already introduced you to this place called the Grand Canyon. Here, the geology of the Earth's crust sits like an open book waiting to be read. Layer upon layer of different rock tells the geologist when this place was covered with a cool ocean and when it was not. So, boys and girls, if you look closely at this picture, you can actually see many of those layers that people like Jerry study to learn more about the Earth. I pointed to a few on the picture. You can see at the top of the picture, there's one layer of lightly colored rock, and right above that, there's another layer of slightly darker rock. Now, if you look at that picture a little more closely and you move down towards the bottom, well, we know that those are the older layers of rock. And if we look closely, we can see those layers, but they're a lot thinner than the ones on the top. If you look closely, there are almost too many layers in this picture to count. And each one of those layers tells us something about our planet Earth. Geological or earth changes can do all sorts of tricky things to the rock on the Earth's crust. These formations in Arches National Park in the state of Utah show that thousands of years of wind, rain, and ice, what it can do to this type of stone. Some rocks are mysterious. This is called Uluru, or Ayers Rock. It's the only tall thing in an otherwise flat, barren grassland in the middle of Australia. Geologists have figured out that this is a remnant left over from a time when the entire surface there was covered in this type of rock. Eventually, all the other rock eroded away due to wind and rain, and only this one mound of rock remains. So when we look at this piece of rock and we think about our vocabulary word eroded, so after many, many millions of years, what we're seeing in this picture, that's just a very small part. If we would have seen this same place, say, millions of years ago, it would have been nothing but rock like we see in the picture. But over many, many, many millions of years, wind and rain have caused it to be eroded. So now all we see is this one small part that's left over. Different places tell different stories. Not all interesting rocks are above ground. This photo was taken down in a cave, which is a large hole or space underground. A cave is basically an area in the Earth's crust that has been hollowed out for one reason or another, usually as a result of underground water flowing in and dissolving the rock over millions of years. Caves are really amazing places to explore. People usually do not think too much about what's happening deep underground, right below our feet. But the fact is that what happens deep underground has everything to do with what we see in the world around us. Next time, we'll take a closer look at what's happening in those other layers. I'd better go ahead and fill in this hole now. See you next time. All right, boys and girls, I hope that you listen very closely. As always, we want to ask you a few questions to see how much you can remember about our home planet, the Earth, and some of the things that we've just been reading about. Here's my friend Miss Katie again. Thanks for helping us out again, Miss Katie.
You're welcome.
I'm going to ask the kids at home some questions, and I'm going to ask you too.
Okay.
And we're going to, as they answer, you and I are going to go ahead and see if we can answer them as well.
Okay.
Okay? So first, we read all about the Earth, what's inside and out. So what is inside of the Earth? What is it that Jerry studies? What is inside of the Earth that Jerry likes to study? Do you remember? What do you remember?
I remember when Jerry was digging in the earth. When he pulled the dirt out, all of a sudden there was rocks inside of the dirt. So I think there's rocks inside of the earth.
Right. So there are rocks inside of the Earth. And what do those rocks, after many, many, many millions of years, what do those rocks form over and under other things?
Oh yeah, that's layers. That's one of our vocabulary words.
That's right. They form layers. So scientists like Jerry look at all those layers of rocks, just like we saw in that picture at the Grand Canyon, and they're able to tell all kinds of neat things that happened on the Earth. So we're going to use this picture of the Earth for the next part. I'm going to point to the layer, and I want to see if you guys at home can remember what the name of that layer is, okay? So I'm pointing at this very, let me move right here. I'm pointing at this very, 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 very thin outer part of our planet, the outermost layer of the planet. Think hard. If you'll remember at the beginning, we talked about a piece of bread. It also has this. Do you remember what we call that outermost layer of the Earth?
I do. This outermost layer of the Earth is called the crust.
Awesome. That's right. I had just thought of that too. We call that the crust. And just like on a piece of bread, it's the thin outside layer. Okay? Now, when we go deeper in the Earth, this reddish brown layer, which actually takes up most of the Earth, what do we call that? What do we call that layer of the planet? It's right under the crust, but it's right above the core. Do you remember what the next layer was called?
I do. The next layer of the Earth, which is one of the larger portions of the Earth, is actually called the mantle. The
mantle. Very good. It's not like the mantle we have at home where we hang our Christmas stockings, is it?
No, it's
not.
No,
this is a whole nother mantle altogether. This is the mantle of the Earth. It's deep, deep inside. Interesting fact, Did you know that scientists have been trying for years and years and years to dig through the crust into the mantle? But guess what? Nobody's been able to do it yet. So even though the crust looks really, really, really thin here, it is very, very, very deep as well. So that's something that I thought was really, really interesting, and I might even want to learn a little bit more about. So as we go deeper into the earth, we have these two sections. We have the orange section, and then we have the yellow section that's right there in the center. Now, what do we call, they both have part of the name. What do we call all of those parts right here? They have one word.
That would be the center, so that would be the core.
That's right. The yellow part is the inner core, and this orange section would be, that's right, the outer core. And the earth, through all of the pressure and heat, this core is very different than the crust and the mantle on the outer parts of the earth because it's actually made up of melted metal. Isn't that interesting? So when we think about Jerry, and we just kind of answered this question, Jerry's always digging, right? He's always digging. But we want to be able to think, is Jerry digging in the crust? Is he digging in the mantle? Or is Jerry digging in the core? Think about what we just talked about and come up with your answer. What do you think?
I think if they said that he was digging in the crust, they are exactly right.
That's right. They're digging in the, if he's digging in the crust, that's exactly right. Scientists have tried with all kinds of equipment to get deeper than the crust, and so far, nobody's been able to do it. Excellent. So, this is another question. I'm trying to trick you and you guys at home. We're standing on a layer right now. It's the layer on which we live. It's the layer where everything pretty much we know about on Earth happens in our daily lives. So, what part of the Earth are we on right now? Think about that. What do you think?
Well, if the crust is the outside part of the earth, I think that we are on the surface or the top of the earth.
That's right. We're on the surface or the top of the earth, right on top of the crust. Great job, guys. And everything we know of, even though birds fly above the crust, right? They're still above the crust. And even though some animals live deep down into the earth, they're still in the crust. They can't dig below that. Why do geologists study the layer of the rocks in the Earth's crust? Why is it important for geologists to study the layers of the Earth?
Well, there's lots of different ways or reasons that you would want to study something, but I think that, like you said in the read aloud, that it tells us a lot about the Earth.
By studying, exactly, by studying certain layers, by studying all these layers of the Earth, scientists can tell what was going on the Earth during that period of time. Because if you remember, when we talk about time in geology, we're not talking about just days or weeks. We're talking about millions and billions of years. So each time a geologist studies a layer of the Earth, it's like a way for them to take a trip back in time and look at those rocks to see what was going on Earth back that millions and billions of years ago. All right. Great job. Great job. Thanks for helping me remember all those really cool facts. So we wanted to just make sure. Great job answering the questions today out there, young boys, boys and girls. We want to say all rights and credits from this lesson belong to Core Knowledge Language Arts, and we want to thank them for publicly sharing those. And we want you to go home and share what you've learned today with somebody at home or at school or from the neighborhood. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.